For the first 21 years of my life while living full-time in America, I was the quiet one. People would often ask me to speak up and I couldn't get my voice heard in a crowd. Every behavior report card from my teachers made sure to mention that I was quiet, sometimes with the insinuation that I actually needed to talk louder. Then, when I turned 22, I suddenly became loud. People started saying things to me like, "Why are you yelling?" or "I'm right here," or "Everyone can hear you." So what happened overnight? I moved to the UK, of course, and suddenly my quiet became this country's loud, and I learned firsthand that the stereotype that Americans are loud is probably true. I say probably true because I can't find exact science showing the decibel levels to compare, but suffice it to say that plenty of online discourse and my personal experience supports the fact that Americans speak much more loudly by default than the Brits. Now, it's important to mention that plenty other cultures also have this loud stereotypes. Spaniards and Italians, for example, but the Brits, they're not known for being quite as quiet as the Nordic countries, but on the spectrum of quiet to loud, they're definitely on the quiet half, spending much of their time wondering why the Americans won't use their inside voices and have to yell everything across the building. But why? What is it in a culture that develops this higher volume of speaking, or inversely, a quieter and more reserved volume? And how does it impact what is considered rude in each country? Because what's fascinating to me is that often in the UK, being loud or being able to be overheard is considered rude. But in the US, it's actually considered rude if you're speaking to someone and being too quiet. I'm not talking about actual screaming here, but it's almost a worse offense to be too quiet or mumbling or unable to be heard in America than it is to be too loud. So let's unpack this. Firstly, we've got the practical element. The US is a much larger country than the UK, and not only does that mean more space to yell across, but it also means less emphasis on being aware of how much noise you're making because you're further away from the person next to you. So there is, in some ways, a lack of consideration of noise in the US because we're more used to a culture where you're in your individual car, in your detached house, further away from other people. From stores to restaurants, we just have more space to shout across. In the UK, a more densely populated country, plus just quite a small living area, and that's not a criticism, it's just a fact. My house is 600 square foot in the southeast of England, and that costs the same amount as my friend's 2,000 square foot house in the US. Anyway, a more densely populated country may have developed a quieter speaking tone because there's A, less need to be louder, and B, for a consideration that you're often very close to others. And I did also find actual research to suggest that people talk more loudly in warmer climates than in colder ones, suggesting that more time able to be spent outdoors might mean more space and a louder group of talkers. This holds true for other European countries as well, like I mentioned in the beginning, where Spaniards are much louder than those in the Nordic countries. Then we have the cultural elements to consider. I've talked a lot on this channel about how assertiveness and self-promotion is more common in the US. This is something we actively try to instill in kids, and I spent many days in public school learning about public speaking and doing all kinds of exercises to try and be able to present and promote myself well. This can lead to a louder volume of speaking just naturally because you're actively trying to take up space and be heard because it shows confidence, which is a positive value in the US. In the UK, it's much more of a positive thing to be seen as not thinking too much of yourself, not selling yourself, and being humble. And this leads to a culture where being quieter and more reserved are seen as good manners and something that you should aspire to do. That's not to say that those in the UK don't focus on presenting or public speaking, but it's almost as if in the UK, that stuff is seen as for specific moments when you need it. Whereas in the US, you're almost always expected to be in that mode and on, showcasing that confidence or assertiveness. When we're talking about values too, historically, America places a large emphasis on speaking up. American history celebrates the story of the colonists who are seen to have risen up or spoken up against the crown. I do find it difficult in these videos recently to speak in generalizations about the US because the current atmosphere in the US almost needs its own statements and its own research, but traditionally, American culture has prioritized speaking up. And this translates not just into an ideological version of speaking up, but a volume one too. Then we have the class system hypothesis to contend with. In the UK, typically speaking louder is associated with lower classes. To be in a higher class is to be more demure, more soft-spoken, and to not be seen as rowdy. And so, being quiet or reserved is seen as the positive thing, and being loud is seen as the negative thing, something that is only fit for people who aren't as high up in the social ranks. The USA doesn't have the same type of rigid class system as the UK, as I've talked about in other videos, which gives a little bit less of a social weight to certain behaviors. That's not to say that the USA doesn't have a class system, it absolutely does, but it's not quite as easy to use in this instance to explain differences in speaking volume like we can with the British system. And it can't go without being said that sometimes the Brits are seen as the loud ones. If you've ever been to a football game in the UK or experienced Brits in popular holiday destinations, certainly no one is looking at them and thinking they're quiet and reserved in those times. But Americans are seen and do actually speak loudly at basically all times, no matter home or abroad, in a restaurant or on the street. And the final catch is that when everyone is speaking at a lower inside voice or more softly, then there's no need to speak up or speak loudly because you can be easily heard anyway. But when you're in America and everyone is speaking loudly, then you need to as well in order to have a conversation. The loud talking leads to loud talking leads to loud talking, and that's why my own tendency to speak loudly in the UK often comes as a surprise to me. Because if I spoke like this in the US, no one else would overhear me because they'd be too busy talking loudly themselves. My volume would just be the normal volume. Now that brings us to the end of this video. As always, I hope this video helped you think about an interesting cultural difference. Feel free to share your thoughts both quietly and loudly in the comments below.